going back to a non-cheerful note for a bit. I've prepared this talk with my brother Adam Carter, who teaches at the University of Lethbridge, and he teaches in English, and he's a specialist in Canadian literature. And this is our first effort to work together. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here because they're still in the middle of exams at the University of Lethbridge. So thank you so much. I really welcome this opportunity to try to pull this together. Adam and I have talked about working on this topic for quite a number of years. And what we're asking is, what role did freezing to death play within the mythology of Canada as a northern nation, where a bracing, invigorating environment, supposedly one that supposedly created vigorous, hardy citizens, strong and free. What role did freezing play in this mythology? What happened when those citizens froze to death? Freezing, we found, separated the fit from the unfit and success from failure. Americans might freeze, but Canadians would not freeze. Men who lacked masculinity might freeze, for example. But in rare cases, it was also possible to nobly and heroically freeze to death if you had lived a Christian and virtuous life. So I want to begin with Adam's section, that's more of the literary, and then turn to mine, which is more the historical. And probably as we think it through a little bit more, we'll want to have a different sort of structure to this and meld it together a bit, but that's how this is going to be presented today. And Adam's is more, mine's more the prairies, and he's gone a little bit farther afield. So we may end up calling this Freezing to Death in the Northern Nation. In a landmark article published almost 50 years ago, the Canadian historian Carl Berger began to explore how the idea of Canada as a northern nation of northern people had functioned ideologically in the half-century or so following Confederation in 1867. The title of Berger's article was "The True North, Strong and Free," and it's taken from our national anthem, the first verse of "O Canada," that we sing at hockey games and in school and other sorts of occasions. And it indicates how deeply inscribed the idea of the North is in Canadian nationhood. In his essay, Berger identifies 4 functions the idea of Canada as a northern nation played. First, it could evoke a kind of environmental determinism to suggest that the rugged, harsh climate would over time create a strong and healthy people, as well as shape people of diverse cultural and national origins into the same mold, producing the sort of homogeneous national character which was felt to be needed but lacking in the citizenry of the new nation. Secondly, and more perniciously, again this is Berger, drawing from social Darwinism and supposedly scientific theories of racial difference, the idea of the northern nation could invoke a racial determinism which suggested that Canada was only fit for those in whose blood already ran the genes of the northern nations of Europe. It thereby served to mark Canada off as an unfit environment for Southern Europeans or Asians or African Americans. Thirdly, and relatedly, it served to mark Canada as distinct from and superior to its southern neighbor, the United States, which Canadians are just very much obsessed with, showing our superiority. Fourthly, it was associated with a number of desirable characteristics such as the love of liberty, self-governance, rationality, and adventuresome spirit of expansion. And Adam writes that one were extending and updating Berger's investigations, as has been done, for example, in the work of Cheryl Grace, a literary scholar in the University of British Columbia. One would note as well that the discourse of northernism is a distinctly gendered one, which marks off the proper, dominant subject of the nation as conventionally masculine. And one would reflect on the irony that Indigenous peoples, with the strongest claim to northern heritage, are almost entirely erased from the discourse, represented in ways that nonetheless mark them as unfit unless they're thoroughly assimilated. The myth of the North that Berger concluded from his mid-20th century perspective still functioned when he wrote that article as John Diefenbaker, who was Prime Minister in the late and mid-1950s, drew upon the theme of northern expansion. And one can affirm a half-century later that the myth continues to circulate in ways both fascinating and, given its roots, passing strange, Toronto's National Basketball Association franchise, the Toronto Raptors, for example, and it's an early National Basketball Association team in Canada, but they've adopted this wildly successful phrase. Who's from Canada and knows what is the phrase? I have a t-shirt. My husband's got 10 of them. We the North.
We the North.
We the North. To promote the sense of collective identity among the fans of the team, the Raptors. And it's a team comprised almost exclusively of American and international players, many of African Americans. Still, we the North. The idea of Canada as a northern nation has functioned ideologically both to suggest an environment that strengthens and energizes its subjects physically, morally, and intellectually, and marks off the fit from the unfit. I think I'm supposed to say, if the idea of Canada as a northern nation has functioned ideologically, then what roles, one might ask, have representations of freezing to death or hypothermia played within such a mythology? One exceedingly positive view of the process was suggested by a medical doctor from Montreal in 1884, William Hales Hingston, in his book, The Study of Climates. And he wrote, "The countenances of those frozen to death are singularly calm and placid, and not indicative of any suffering." He wrote that there was a smile on the frozen victim, as if he or she had had a vision of the afterlife and was content to drift off. And he continued, "Those who have been aroused from the lethargy which precedes death describe that state as one exquisitely free from pain or suffering or anxiety." But the evidence from the literary and historical records indicate little basis for such a positive view of freezing to death, and we must look elsewhere to understand how representations of such an event may have been functioning. A tradition of Marxist critique suggests that the central function of ideology is to reify social reality, to make complex, fluid, historical, and social processes appear as rigid, unalterable things we must accept as inevitable and unchangeable. In effect, a kind of freezing. A favorite handbook of critical terms uses the word freezes to define reification. One might then understand freezing to be at the core of the ideological process and figures or representations of freezing in the ideology of the northern nation to be practically central to its function. Certainly freezing is inscribed into the very idea of the North, as in the common phrase, the frozen North. If the North is a challenging environment in which one must struggle to survive, then freezing to death is the boundary that separates success from failure, life from death. The right amount of cold is invigorating, too much is annihilating. This is the borderline that a mythology of the northern nation negotiates. As with the broader mythology of the North, of which it is a part, this boundary has been represented in a multiplicity of ways and served a multiplicity of functions. And then as a section about freezing to death is not, of course, unique to Canadian literature. There's British broadside ballads such as Mary of the Wild Moors, The Forsaken Mother and Child, featuring sometimes women, mothers and their children freezing to death. Other traditional folk songs. In the literature of Canada, there are many works that feature freezing to death as a plot element. And then he goes on to discuss some in greater detail. Frederick Philip Grove's 1932 short story, Snow, narrates the search of two men for Redcliffe, a farmer who was not returned to his farmhouse after the previous day's blizzard. His corpse is discovered with a quiet expression as of painless rest on his face. The farmer's horse and cart had become immovably stuck during the blizzard. His last small act of heroism is to unhitch the horses so they might not perish in the storm, and one does find its way home. Grove's prairie characters are situated in a harsh, indifferent world that annihilates even the strong, the brave, and the good. And then he goes on to discuss a Sinclair Rust 1939 story, The Painted Door. It features the frozen death of a farmer who successfully struggles to reach home in a blizzard, only to find that his wife Anne is asleep in bed with Stephen, a neighboring farmer he had invited to look in on her while he was away for the day, tending his aging parents. Amidst the raging blizzard in the night, Anne at first believes that she had only dreamt that John had returned to the house, a figment of her guilty conscience. She discovers the next day, however, white paint on the hand of John's frozen corpse, and that proves that he had indeed returned during the night, because she painted the door of the bedroom earlier in the day. In Ross's story, cold and freezing function complexly as a metaphor for variously a passionless marriage, isolation, cold reason in contrast to a heated passion, the indifference of a harsh world to human desire, and how actions can become unalterable once taken. And then Adam means to write more about Duncan Campbell Scott's The Forsaken. He was a poet of the early 20th century. He was also a Department of Indian Affairs top Superintendent General of Indian Affairs administrator. And one of his most popular poems, The Forsaken, is about the frozen death of an Indigenous woman, and it's a way of supporting Scott's assimilationist viewpoints. He celebrates her as brave and dauntless in many respects, but her culture has forsaken her, leaving her to die. But the rest of Adam's section here focuses on surely what he calls the best-known treatment in Canadian literature of freezing to death in the harsh northern environment. And again, I'll ask Canadians, what would come to mind? It's not a prairie story, but the most famous, it is a poem about freezing to death in the northern environment.
Cremation of Sam McGee.
Okay. Robert Service, 1907, wildly popular poets. I think many of us can actually, say it by heart. The art.
Yeah.
It's
strange.
for gold. Okay. Yes, exactly. Okay, so it was 1907. It was in his book Songs of a Sourdough, okay. Adam has a section about how really he wasn't so much a sourdough himself. Service, he was a clerk at the Canadian Bank of Commerce at the time in Whitehorse and Dawson. Although lighthearted fare, one might see the ideological work of Northern nationhood operating in this poem, a possibility that might additionally account for its popularity in the Canadian school system, where we still all had to memorize it, it seems. The second verse begins, however, now Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home in the south to roam round the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. So Sam then is an American, although the real Sam McGee was in fact a Canadian who died on an Alberta farm in the 1940s. And Service met him and Sam McGee allowed him to use his name in the poem, and a little bit about his real life, but he changed it and altered it, and Sam became an American. So an American is who freezes to death in this poem. In creating the fictional Sam McGee, Service Americanizes his subject, strengthening it as a kind of allegory of who does and doesn't belong there. In particular, the fictional McGee hails from the warm and sunny South, a designation that not only allows McGee, Tennessee, to rhyme, but marks him in even starker opposition to the cold northern climate in a north-south antithesis that has operated for centuries to demarcate the strong from the weak, the head from the body, the rationally self-controlled from the overly sensual, impulsive, and recklessly uncontrolled. McGee hates his adopted environment. He would sooner live in hell. Only greed for gold keeps him riveted to the place as if under a spell, or perhaps as if already frozen in place. The materialistic, profit-driven American is a recurrent type in the tropes of a national character in Canadian culture and literature. There's other examples of that. Sam whimpers on this trip that he's taking with Cap across the frozen north, and the lack of a properly hardy masculine struggle with an environment that is believed to strengthen those who are fit for it in the first place marks Sam, along with his sensitivity to the cold, as the wrong kind of subject for the northern nation. So he's cremated by Cap, the narrator, in this derelict ship on the marge of Lake Labarge. And it's the last lines of the narrative that Cap looks in on him as he's burning in this, as he's cremated, and he looks now finally quite content, almost that smile that doctor said. And he says, since I left Plum Tree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm. Of note here is that only as a corpse does McGee possess the hardiness and pleasure in his environment that he lacked in his life, as the narrator allows that half mad, he'd often sing to the hateful thing and it hearkened with a grin, because he's frozen and lashed to the sleigh for quite a bit of the poem. Okay, so Canadians are made of sterner stuff. Now I'm going to turn to the historical record, which my work focuses on. Freezing to death was an unfortunate fact of life in early settlement days. There's a website called Peel's Prairie Provinces that anyone can look up of newspapers, and it's mainly Alberta newspapers, and there's 777 hits for frozen to death. And these would be like man frozen to death, farmer frozen to death, probably frozen to death, miners frozen to death, homesteader frozen to death, or settler frozen to death. One of the most tragic and horrifying and potentially ruinous events was 1882. It was called the Meadowley Tragedy, and it's remembered in poems and songs and a book, one book at least. It was in Manitoba, where a mother and 3 daughters froze to death, and another visitor, a woman, froze her fingers. She lost her fingers. They were all English immigrants. Authorities and promoters of settlement wanted to downplay and deny that people froze on the one hand, but when it happened, it could be explained, rationalized, and pressed into service for a variety of causes: moralistic, religious, cautionary, to show the superiority of British settler colonialism, to police acceptable feminine and masculine behavior as well. Promoters of Canadian settlement were desperate to hide the realities of the winter temperatures and the blizzards. Promotional literature was very misleading. One example was from a Central Alberta pamphlet from 1911. It stated, "The winters in Central Alberta are neither long nor unduly severe. The snowfall is light, barely enough for sleighing, and blizzards are unknown." It said that you could walk or drive in the winter without any discomfort, with keen enjoyment. It is true that low temperatures are registered, but these are slips of very occasional occurrence and last only for very brief periods. Promoters of settlement in Western Canada were furious when Rudyard Kipling wrote his poem in 1897, "My Lady of the Snows." There was a huge reaction that he had promoted this idea of Western Canada as the frozen North. One person concerned about immigration said that Kipling had created an image of Canada as the Siberia of the British Empire. So Canada was very concerned to counter this. They also had to they had to battle on another front, because the Americans loved to present Canada as a very hostile environment. They delighted in presenting arid and Arctic prairies in their promotional literature to discourage settlers from going north to Canada. But on the other hand, sometimes it was useful for Canadian authorities to promote the cold as inhospitable. They didn't want women to imagine that they could come out and farm on their own in Western Canada. And there was quite a bit of, so it's something I've just written a book about, and so don't get me started. But anyway, they were desperate to show that this was not acceptable. So in promotional literature about occupations for women in Canada, for example, one warned that farming for women was difficult because the winters are very severe. Men and women have been lost in a blizzard going from the house to the barn. So in that case, it was useful to present it as something that was, as a climate that was not hospitable. There's frozen women's stories I find across, in many places, but in a lot of local histories that show that women should not be living independently. A woman from Ireland came up to north of Hannah, Alberta, and built herself a house with an absolutely useless fireplace, according to a local history. And she was described as an old maid who was partially paralyzed. Although a nephew lived with her for a time, she was all alone when she took sick and was found by the neighbors frozen to death under her kitchen table. So that message was that you shouldn't imagine you can come out here and live on your own. Frozen stories were also used to censure males deemed too delicate, effete, and green for harsh conditions, and that's been examined by historian Joe Chowinski in a book about myths of frozen Englishmen. Frozen stories were used to condemn and police unacceptable behavior. Alcohol and prostitution could lead to being frozen while drunk, as was the case in 1896 of alleged prostitute found lying in a lane in Winnipeg. A well-known habitué was out of the city jail. A drunken man falling on the road is certain to die, wrote one authority. So today we tell people not to drink and drive, and then back in the early settlement days, it was don't drink and walk, at least not in the a staple of missionary literature was that, and this is referred to in the poem I was looking at by Scott, is that Indigenous women who were elderly and weak were left to freeze to death. This was not the case, but it was a staple of a stereotype or misrepresentation used to promote missionary work and the need to Christianize and colonize. One missionary wrote, according to the heartless custom of some of the tribes, when women reached the time of age of life when they can neither snare rabbits or catch fish, they're thrown out of their wigwams in the bitter cold and left to freeze to death. And that trope you could find throughout. What I found in my own work, however, is that more likely the women to be frozen were those settler women who were deliberately frozen to death, as it was a form of abuse and even murder. There was the case of Anna Orphanson from a homestead near Moose Jaw. She was admitted to the Moose Jaw Hospital in 1912 with both feet frozen. She'd been driven from her home by her husband and had been left outside all night. Amputation followed, and her neighbors raised funds for a pair of artificial legs. And that was a particularly bitterly cold winter, and there was a similar case in Bigger, Saskatchewan, that same month when James Sidney drove his wife Florence and their son Samuel from their home in the middle of the night in the extreme cold, and they were found dead the next morning. And some of this curiosity about all of this, which is certainly more in the extreme, I suppose, but there's the infamous Starlight Tours of the Saskatoon City Police Force. About a decade and a half ago, a young Indigenous man was found frozen on the edge of town, where he'd been left by the Saskatoon Police Force. And this led to a huge inquiry, and found that it was not alone, that it was something that the Saskatoon police used. That they would leave young men without proper clothing at the edge of town and get them to, and forcing them to walk back. So freezing to death was also used to illustrate the masculinity required to survive on the prairies. I'm going to return for a minute to the Meadow Lee disaster that I mentioned at the earlier part. The mother and 3 daughters died. I should just be a minute more. How much time do we have till? 5 minutes. Okay, that should be it. So the Meadow Lee disaster, the mother and the daughters died. The question always was, the puzzle, why did the father, John, survive? One of the poems, and there were several ends, a mother and her daughters 3 had perished on the plains. And of that happy family, but John alone remains. The neighbors gather one by one and search the prairie round, and here and there in reefs of snow a frozen corpse was found. Was ever anything so sad, or did you ever see a case so strange and pitiful as this in Meadow Lee? And strange it was indeed. A few years later, Robert Dezel, a Methodist author, interviewed the survivors and wrote a book for the Methodist missionary tracts called A Night on the Prairie, the Meadow Lee Tragedy. And it became a tale of a Methodist family that led through severe trials, and that we must all reflect upon the suddenness of the call and heed the warning, be ye also ready, for the Son of Man cometh at an hour when ye think not. So they were blessed to have been devout Methodists. But he also had to struggle with what happened, why did John survive? And Dezel paints Mr. Taylor as an unfit subject for settlement and an unfit patriarch to have been in charge of 3 women and his 3 daughters and his wife. He was corpulent. He had a paralytic stroke before coming west. He was lame. He had financial troubles, and he was in a helpless physical condition. The suggestion was that hard times had made him deranged and demoralized. So the message was clearly that this was not the type of masculinity that was required on the prairies, and the females were helpless with that as their patriarch, with John as their patriarch. So just one last category of frozen stories. I mentioned it was possible to freeze heroically and nobly. One example is George McDougall, a Methodist missionary who died in 1876 in January. He was known as the hero of the Saskatchewan after his frozen death. There's just many poems, again, chapters, books about him. And through his death, he became this noble martyr to the cause. As a missionary had faced deprivation and disease to bring the gospel to a united race, is how he was described in one such. When he was found, it appeared he had calmly and peacefully passed away. He had closed his eyes, and he had a smile allegedly on his countenance. That's what his wife wrote in a letter that was republished many times in Methodist missionary literature. One of the poem ends, Him dangers never ceased to yield, nor boundaries knew his mission field. As kind as brave each lingering trace on George McDougall's smiling face of goodness bearing still. So there was hope. There was hope for those who froze after a virtuous life, then, that you would die with a smile on your face and you would be contented. So Adam and I don't have any conclusion. We haven't really had time to discuss it. I think that the George McDougall example, though, points to how it would be very interesting to pursue how Indigenous people perceived freezing and freezing to death, and freezing of a missionary like George McDougall. Because far from being the hero and the revered missionary, he was very, there were very negative views of him. He had been responsible for example, stealing and removing a revered stone called the Manitou stone in 1869 that was a very sacred site and a sacred stone, and shipping it off to Toronto. And it was believed by the Cree especially that after that stone was removed from central Alberta, that this had led to the disease, the smallpox outbreak of 1869, as well as the disappearance of the buffalo, and so many of those other hardships. So I think that they would have seen his death in such a different light, and that's certainly something that I want to explore further with Adam as we continue this project. Well, thank you.